I continue to have significant concerns about your judgment and your qualifications to meet the standards set by law. First, as I noted previously, the D&I was created in part to make sure we had appropriate intelligence sharing, which prior to 9/11, obviously we haven't. But the mission also is to not only share information between the IC, but also with our allies. There's no legal requirement that our allies share intelligence with us. It's all predicated on trust. Trust that our allies will protect each other's secrets. It appears to me you have repeatedly excused our adversaries' worst actions, and instead often blamed them on the United States and those very allies. For example, you blame NATO for Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine. You rejected the conclusion that Assad used chemical weapons in Syria, despite it being the unanimous assessment of the then Trump administration's DOD, State Department, and IC, as well as the assessment of our European allies. Instead, you blame the United States for supporting terrorist groups in Syria. Now, I don't know if your intent in making those statements was to defend those dictators, or if you were simply unaware of the intelligence and how your statements would be perceived. In either case, it raises, at least for this senator, serious questions about your judgment. It also leads me to question whether you can develop the trust necessary to give our allies confidence that they can share their most sensitive intelligence with us. Make no mistake about it. If they stop sharing that intelligence, the United States will be less safe. We've seen this as recently as this past year, where because of those strong intelligence sharing between the United States and Austria, countless lives were saved by disrupting a terrorist attack that was going to take place at the Taylor Swift concert in Vienna. Second, you have been publicly outspoken in your praise and defense of Edward Snowden, someone who betrayed the trust of our nation and jeopardized the security of our country. The truth is, the vast majority of the information he stole and leaked before running off to China and Russia, might I add, had nothing to do with Americans' privacy and compromised our most important sources and methods. And in many ways, we're still paying a price for that. And I believe that Edward Snowden's action put our men and women in uniform in places like Iraq and Afghanistan at risk. You have celebrated Snowden as a, quote, brave whistleblower, and actually put forward legislation asking for his pardon. Furthermore, when given the opportunity to clarify your position in pre-hearing questions, you declined. And instead you expressed, and again I quote, the D&I has no role in determining whether or not Edward Snowden is a lawful whistleblower. Boy, that is troubling to me in so many ways. Not only do you think that someone who divulged secrets and then ran off to Russia should be celebrated as brave, but you don't seem to understand the D&I's role in determining whistleblower determinations. In fact, the D&I has a significant role in transmitting lawful whistleblower complaints to this committee. They're all laid out right here in the statute. And I would have serious concerns about confirming someone who cannot distinguish between complaints that are made lawfully and those that are made not. In the statute, it says the job of the D&I is to protect intelligence sources and methods from unauthorized disclosure. That's a quote. I guess I'm asking, what message would it send to have a D&I who would celebrate the work of a member of the IC or a contractor that would, on their own mission, to decide what's appropriate to leak? I don't understand that. Third, until recently, you had a clear and consistent record of opposing FISA 702. I know members on this committee already understand how important this is, but for folks who don't, this law is critical to our national security. Literally 60% on average of what goes into the president's daily brief, what President Trump will read each day in assessing what's going on in the world comes from this important piece of law that allows us to seek out those foreigners abroad for coverage. And it's helped prevent terrorist attacks. It helps us prevent foreign cyber attacks. It helps us on a topic that a lot of folks are looking at, fentanyl trafficking. Now, many in this Congress and many on the committee have tried to reform this legislation to better balance security and civil liberties. However, you have consistently gone further. Not only did you vote against reauthorizing 702, you actually introduced legislation to fully repeal the whole thing, calling it again, quote, a blatant disregard for our Fourth Amendment constitutional rights. Now, I understand that since you've been nominated to be DNI, you've expressed a change of heart. I think that's welcome, but I have to tell you, as I view this as a job interview, as I try to make my judgment on whether you should be confirmed, I don't find your change of heart credible. Until you are nominated by the president to be the DNI, you consistently praise the actions of Edward Snowden, some who, I believe, jeopardized the security of our nation, and then, in an effort to flaunt that, fled to Russia. You even called Edward Snowden, and I quote here, a brave whistleblower. Every member of this committee supports the rights of legal whistleblowers. But Edward Snowden isn't a whistleblower. And in this case, I'm a lot closer to the chairman's words, where he said, Snowden is, quote, an egotistical, serial liar and traitor who, quote, deserves to rot in jail for the rest of his life. Ms. Gabbard, a simple yes or no question. Do you still think Edward Snowden is brave?
Mr. Vice Chairman, Edward Snowden broke the law. I do not agree with or support with all of the information and intelligence that he released, nor the way in which he did it. There would have been opportunities for him to come to you on this committee or seek out the IG to release that information. The fact is, he also, even as he broke the law, released information that exposed egregious, illegal, and unconstitutional programs that are happening within our government that led to serious reforms that Congress undertook.
Chairman, we got 5 minutes. So I take your answer, and these are your quotes. Brave, please join my bipartisan legislation calling for charges to be dropped against him. Do you disagree that legislation was not appropriate? Do you believe he is brave or not?
Yeah,
back those words?
Once again, Senator, Edward Snowden broke the law. He also released information that exposed the United States government's illegal programs. Your legislation
and your words are still your beliefs. Yes or no, please.
I'm making myself very clear. Edward Snowden broke the law. He released information about the United States government's illegal activities. If I may just finish my thoughts, Senator. In this role that I've been nominated for, if confirmed as Director of National Intelligence, I will be responsible for protecting our nation's secrets, and I have 4 immediate steps that I would take to prevent another Snowden-like leak.
Ma'am, I would simply ask you again. I don't think you're going to answer. I agree with Tom Cotton. He's a traitor. You, for years, until you got chosen by President Trump, have celebrated this guy as brave. You've called for him to be pardoned, for his charges to be dropped. I cannot imagine a director of national intelligence that would say that kind of behavior is okay. How would we maintain the trust of the IC and the contractors who work for it? How would we maintain the trust of our Five Eyes partners? I find it very troubling. Let me move to 702. I know other members are going to raise this. Remember, the 702 is critical to our national security. 60% of the president's daily brief, 60% of the information President Trump gets every day in a PDB will come from this. You've had a long history of opposing 702. Many members of Congress have. But one of the things you actually done that not many have is not to reform it, but you actually said you wanted to repeal it. But now, whether it's, confirmation conversion, or whatever you call 702 vital. And I'm quoting, because of significant FISA reforms have been enacted since you left Congress. Ms. Gabbard, what are the reforms that have led you to now support 702?
In the short time that I have, Senator, I will just note that my actions in legislation in Congress were done to draw attention to the egregious civil liberties violations that were occurring at that time.
Ms. Gabbard, Ms. Gabbard, I ask you a question. Please give me the courtesy of responding. You said the reforms now make you support it. What can you cite? Which reforms?
There are a number of reforms to include
In the
getting
new bill,
rid
in the new law,
that,
right?
that all of you and your
Gabbard,
wisdom.
Ms. Gabbard, my time is getting short. But I got to just tell you, after the reforms were passed into law in April of 24, you went on Joe Rogan's podcast in May. The bill is now law. And you said, quote, "This bill took an already bad problem and made it many, many times worse." Again, in my mind, this is a question of judgment. 702 is critical. I appreciate this late conversion, but I'm not sure I buy it because you've had such a consistent position. Again, I know my colleague's going to raise these, but rather than standing up to dictators like Putin and Assad, you've sometimes amplified his talking points. I mean, I just do not understand how you can blame NATO for Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine. And when Assad used chemical weapons against his own people, you didn't condemn him. I can go through all the quotes. You actually questioned Americans' intelligence. Now, you mentioned a lot about trust. And one of the things that I'm so proud on this committee is, my friend Senator Burr said, we always follow the truth. I say on this committee, the most valuable work I do in this Senate, we have a bipartisan approach to intelligence. I think we have worked to try to keep the intelligence community and earn their trust, and frankly, earn the trust of the American people. But I, respectfully, ma'am, I just don't believe on your judgment and credibility issues that this is the appropriate role that you should take going forward.
I noted that Edward Snowden was in Hawaii, of all places, for a year and a half before he fled to Hong Kong and then on to Russia. Did you ever meet him or have any contact with him during that period, or subsequently with telephone calls, emails, Zooms, contact with he or his lawyers?
No, Senator, not at any time have I had contact with Edward Snowden.
And you introduced a bill in 2020 that was essentially a pardon. It basically said all charges should be dropped. You had a lot of whereases in that bill. Where did the factual basis for those whereas clauses come from?
Senator, if I recall, in that bill, it came from publicly available information.
I see. And were you aware that there was a bipartisan committee report from the House Intelligence Committee in 2016 on Snowden's activities?
I don't recall specifically at that time, but I am aware of that committee's report and executive summary that was reported publicly. I did not have access to the classified report that summary was based on.
Did you read that report prior to filing your bill in 2020?
Senator, I don't recall specifically. I remember reading a lot of materials prior to filing that bill.
Well, the bipartisan committee report, the first item, Edward Snowden perpetrated the largest and most damaging public release of classified information in U.S. intelligence history. Goes on to say Snowden caused tremendous damage to national security, and the vast majority of the documents he stole have nothing to do with programs impacting individual privacy. But you don't recall ever seeing the work of that committee?
I'm aware of those conclusions drawn.
You're aware
Edward
now.
Snowden.
Were you aware at the time?
Yes, I was, Senator. Edward Snowden broke the law. There's no question about that. He should not have released all of that information that caused that harm. There's no question about that.
How many documents did he release?
I know that he took over 1 million documents. I don't know specifically how many of those 1 million he specifically released.
Well, you stated very unequivocally today, Snowden broke the law, but you introduced a bill in Congress along with Congressman Matt Gaetz to essentially pardon him. So he broke the law, but it wasn't all that serious? Is that what you thought in 2020?
I take very seriously upholding our Constitution and have sworn an oath to support and defend that Constitution over 8 times in my life. My statements in the past have been reflective of the egregious and illegal programs that were exposed in that leak.
But you ignore the vast majority, as the committee found, bipartisan. I think Devin Nunes was the chair, Adam Schiff was the vice chair. The conclusion was that the vast majority of these things that he released had nothing to do with constitutional rights, the Fourth Amendment, but indeed were enormous compromises of our national security.
Senator, I focused on raising concerns around egregious, illegal, and unconstitutional programs that our government was conducting that clearly violated Americans' Fourth Amendment rights. I think the most important thing that I hope all of you find to be relevant here is that if confirmed as Director of National Intelligence, I would take seriously the responsibility to protect our nation's secrets, just as I have for almost 20 years of holding a security clearance of some sort myself, either secret or top secret, and have never once violated the responsibility and privilege that comes with holding that clearance, and have a specific action plan in place to make sure that there is not another Snowden-type leak in the future.
I think you testified that you never saw the classified version of this report.
That's correct.
On page 22 of the report, there's a heading that's not classified that says, what damage did Snowden cause? And then there's a lot of redacted material. Did that not raise a red flag for you? Or do you not recall
Edward
seeing
Snowden
that?
broke the law. Like I said, I did not have access to that classified.
Did you seek access to it?
I believe so, yes. This was quite some time ago.
But you still introduced your bill to essentially get
I
it
take
apart.
very seriously the protection of American civil liberties and our Fourth Amendment rights. If confirmed as Director of National Intelligence, I'd make sure that there is no further Snowden-type leak in the future, and that those who have concerns have legal channels to raise those concerns so that we don't violate and release our nation's secrets.
There are about 20 countries in the world that don't.
Senator King, time has expired.
Was Edward Snowden a traitor to the United States of America?
Senator, I will also repeat my answer. He broke the law.
You said earlier that you were offended by a question that my colleague from Kansas asked, which I think was his duty as somebody on this committee to fulfill his responsibility to advise and consent. We are not here to be a rubber stamp for the President of the United States. So let me ask you again, do you believe, as the chairman of this committee believes, as the vast majority of members of our intelligence agencies believe, that Edward Snowden was a traitor to the United States of America?
Senator, if confirmed as Director of National Intelligence, I will work with you to make sure that there is not another Snowden-like leak.
Media. It's not a moment to propagate theories, conspiracy theories, or attacks on journalism in the United States. This is when you need to answer the questions of the people whose votes you're asking for to be confirmed as the Chief Intelligence Officer of this nation. As my colleague said, this is not about you. It's about the people that serve the intelligence agencies of the United States. Is Edward Snowden a traitor to the United States of America? That is not a hard question to answer when the stakes are this high.
Senator, as someone who has
your
served
answer,
in
yes
uniform,
or no, is Edward Snowden a traitor to the United States of America?
as someone who has
I'll go on
worn
to
our
my
uniform
questions.
in combat, I understand how critical our national security
Apparently
is.
you don't. Apparently you don't. Let me ask you, I've worked very hard to put your own words here in front of the committee. Not, fake news, not conspiracy theories on the internet, but the actual things that you have said. On February 23rd, 2022, at the very moment that Russian tanks were rolling across the peaceful border of Ukraine for the first time, you tweeted at 11:30 p.m. your time, "This war and suffering could have easily been avoided if Biden administration / NATO had simply acknowledged Russia's legitimate security concerns regarding Ukraine's becoming a member of NATO." Did you say that, yes or no?
I believe you're reading my tweet, Senator.
Yes is the answer. A few months later, you said on your podcast, and I quoted it, quote, "But this regime change war against Russia that the U.S. and NATO are waging via their proxy in Ukraine didn't begin when Putin invaded Ukraine. They had their eyes set on this objective long before that." Did you say that, yes or no?
I believe you're reading my tweet.
Thank
There's
you.
a lot
The answer
more.
is yes.
You're quoting a podcast that
I'm
provided much more
happy to have a
context.
conversation with the chairman about whether I'm taking anything out of context. I don't think I am. And your answer is yes. Are you aware that your comments about proxy wars and Russia's legitimate security concerns, to quote your own words, are in alignment with what the Russians have said to justify their invasion of Ukraine? Yes or no?
Senator, I don't pay attention to Russian
So I'll
propaganda.
take
My
that as
goal is to
I'll
speak
take
the
that as
truth,
the answer is no.
regardless of whether
Thank
you like it or not.
I'll take it. That's fine. You said you are used to speaking truth to power.
Yes.
I'm shocked to hear you now say that, you are agreeing. I'm not shocked because I know you said it. You are agreeing that you basically said that Putin was justified in rolling over the peaceful border of Ukraine, the first time since World War II that a free nation had been invaded by a totalitarian state. And you were there at 11:30 p.m. that night to say that you were with them, not us. And let me tell you something. You say you don't know because you don't read Russian propaganda. Russian state TV then aired your comments. Did you know that?
Senator, I think you should also quote the statement that I made criticizing Putin for his invasion
What
of
I
Ukraine.
would say, Mr. Chairman, with the last, it's up to all of us. We're the Senate. We get to decide whether we're going to confirm this nominee. Obviously, we didn't select this nominee. But can't we do better than somebody who doesn't believe in 702? Can't we believe that somebody who can't answer whether Snowden was a traitor 5 times today, who made excuses for Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the first time that I'm aware of any American official has done that? I'm questioning her judgment. That's the issue that's at stake here. And as you said, and I totally agree, this is about our intelligence officers. And you cannot answer. Most of what we do here is in secret. This is one of the very few opportunities that you will ever have to have a conversation with this panel in public. And the record is going to be very clear about the position you took with regard to Edward Snowden. And the record is going to be very clear about your reaffirmation of the statements you made in the middle of the night when Russia was invading the free country of Ukraine. And I hope we will take that in consideration when we have this vote.
Your time has expired.
I want to talk to you a little bit about your perspectives on China. How do you view China in your national security role?
Our relationship with China is one that is complex, given how closely our economies are linked. There are a number of challenges and threats that need to be navigated with respect to China, some of which have come up most recently with this very serious cyber exploitation in Salt Typhoon and Volt Typhoon that seemingly took us by surprise, and the compromising of our major telecom companies and an area of significant and great concern.
So some of your past statements that are relevant to China are concerning because I don't think it fully appreciates China's perspective towards the United States. For example, with regard to TikTok. Your past statements have essentially said that requiring domestic ownership of TikTok is a violation of civil liberties, and the national security concerns are complete BS. Can you explain why you have this view on TikTok?
The position that I previously made, obviously not as a member of Congress, as you consider the TikTok legislation, were centered around the protection of Americans' First Amendment rights and the lack of data privacy legislation, frankly, that would apply to TikTok, Facebook, X, all of these different social media applications that collect on us as users of these applications. There were other provisions within that legislation that granted very vague and grandiose authorities to the president on deciding which private companies are or are not a national security threat.
So let's talk about China specifically, because this is where I want to make sure you understand what's at stake. We've had concerns over many years that when China owns infrastructure, it can manipulate that infrastructure. It can use it for spying. It could use it, turn it on or off. And you've actually addressed some of the most recent cyber attacks that we believe China had relevant participation. The challenge is if China owns TikTok, it means they can spy on the United States, on the American people. It can take all the data from our children. It can change the narrative about what people are talking about through their algorithms. If it wants to create misinformation or malign foreign influence, it's very easy. So can you understand why it's so important that we require domestic ownership of TikTok?
I understand the concern, Senator. I would just reiterate some of my concerns that I stated in the past about how this really is an issue about data privacy, because so much of what is collected by all of these, even U.S.-owned companies, can be sold to any country.
I get it, and that is a bigger issue for Congress to wrestle, and I am all in for that conversation. But I want you to appreciate China. What is your view with regard to Taiwan? Do you think it is something that your intelligence efforts will understand how important our relationship is with Taiwan, specifically on chips manufacturing? I think President Trump has most recently decided to have a 100% tariff on all chips from Taiwan. And your statements, particularly about the bill we passed, the CHIPS Act, to make sure that domestic production is invested in, and so that we have that supply chain, and so we have that national security. But your public statements about the CHIPS Act have been very negative and don't seem to appreciate how important that independence is for our national security, to be beholden to China, to be beholden to Taiwan, to be in a place where we can't do our own national intelligence.
Yes, Senator, I fully support the investment in building and strengthening our own domestic capabilities. If I recall, that legislation had a lot of other provisions in it that had nothing to do with the production of our own capability, and I felt were a distraction away from and a potential obstacle towards achieving that.
So you will recommend to the president that we continue to invest in the semiconductor industry in the United States for our own independence as well as our own national security?
Yes, Senator, and I would base my recommendations on a number of all of these issues, if confirmed as D&I, based on the full assessment of the intelligence picture so that the president understands the ramifications and the potential cost towards any one of these policy positions that he will make and all of you will make.
And last, I want to return to the Soleimani strike. At the time, you said it was illegal, that President Trump did was illegal, would cause very significant problems down the line. What is your position on that strike, and will you be able to advise the president in future issues with regard to national security?
Those broader issues that I raised with regard to war powers, I have been consistent on. I didn't have access to all of the information behind that strike at the time, and my concerns were that that may be an escalatory action. President Trump was right. There was no escalation beyond that, and his policies towards Iran turned out to be very effective for our own national security.
Thank you, Senator Gillibrand.
Do you disagree with the president taking away the protection for those who are now being targeted in retaliation from the Soleimani strike, such as previous Secretary Pompeo?
Senator, I can't answer that without being able to look at the intelligence assessment and the threat assessment for that or other decisions.
Thank you, Senator Gillibrand.
You're nominated to lead and coordinate across the intelligence community's numerous sources of collection and analytic capabilities. In a few sentences, Can you describe how you make assessments and how you're going to sift through all this intelligence and make careful and thoughtful conclusions?
Yes, Senator, there are great professionals who work within the intelligence community. I will build a strong team around me as they present the intelligence reporting to provide to the President through the President's daily brief and to respond to issues and concerns that this body has. I will welcome dissenting voices to be able to make sure that this information intelligence is thoroughly vetted prior to presenting it, and make sure that the truth is reported, whether that truth is convenient or not.
Well, thank you, Ms. Colonel Gabbard, and I appreciate that. The President and others are going to rely on that. I want to discuss such an assessment made by the IC. For years, the U.S. analyzed evidence of numerous chemical weapons attacks in Syria. Eventually, we were able to assess that Bashar al-Assad was responsible for a number of these attacks that slaughtered his own civilians. Do you accept the conclusion broadly that Assad used chemical weapons against Syrians?
Yes, and I'm on the record for years of agreeing with that broad assessment.
Thank you. Among the attacks the U.S. assessed Assad was responsible for are two that occurred in Douma and Khan Sheikhoun in Syria. As a member of Congress and as a presidential candidate, and as recently as this month, in your written responses to this committee, you have cast doubt on the assessment that Assad is culpable in these two attacks. Is that still your position?
Senator, I raised those questions given conflicting information and evidence that was presented at that time.
Okay. Well, thank you. So to help inform the public, the Trump administration released declassified intelligence in 2017 and again in 2018, showing how experts analyzed multiple types of evidence, satellite imagery, medical experts' witnesses, describing sources and showing the reasoning used to determine Assad's culpability in using these chemical weapons, including in Douma and Khan Sheikhoun in these attacks, the ones that you questioned. I have two documents I want to submit for the record, Mr. Chairman.
Admitted.
Thank you. Were you aware of the declassified assessments, the one I referenced?
Yes, I was.
And as a member of the House Armed Services Committee and the Foreign Affairs Committee, did you take time to review these?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And can you explain to me then why you doubted the intelligence community's conclusions in these two cases, Douma and Khan Sheikhoun, but not the others? And please be specific.
These two cases were being looked at as to be used as a pretext for major military movement, and my fear was a repeat of the deployment of another 500,000 soldiers like we saw in Iraq towards what was the Obama administration's goal, which was regime change in Syria. The question specifically that I raised around these two came about because there were two reasons. One, that assessment was made with high confidence and low information. The information that they had came from those on the ground in an al-Qaeda-controlled area, and therefore were al-Qaeda-linked sources. And there was conflicting information that came from the UN's Office on the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons inspectors, as well as an MIT professor, Ted Postel,
So I
who
want to talk
looked at
about him
these
for a
extensively.
second. So did you look into his credentials, yes or no?
Yes.
And were you aware of his appearances on Russian Today, which is used by the Russians to disseminate government-approved messages?
No.
Were you aware Postel relied on a chemistry student with a record of defending the Assad regime?
At that time, I was not. I have been made aware since.
Do you consider this person or these two individuals now, do you consider them a better source for the chemistry of sarin gas than the U.S. intelligence community?
I assess that at the time, the information, I don't know the second person you're referring to, but MIT professor Ted Postel and the inspectors of the OPCW provided some credible questions that deserved examination.
Okay, thank you. Did you attempt to weigh Postel's claims against the significant evidence and assessments already conducted by the IC?
Yes, I did.
Okay, thank you. So here's my concern here, Colonel. When we began this, you described a thoughtful approach to analyzing intelligence and reaching conclusions. This is what we expect of our professionals. But we just kind of walked through how you came to question Assad's use of chemical weapons in these two cases with a different approach. And I don't reject seeking out differing viewpoints. We need to do that. But you started from a place of doubting the conclusions of the U.S. intelligence community, and then you sought out information that confirmed your viewpoint. That led you to embrace the opinions of two individuals that I think we disagree on this. You think they had expertise, I do not, and others do not. But these individuals were sympathetic to Russia and the Assad regime. It also led you to minimize or discount the overwhelmingly information that contradicted your viewpoint, including the expert assessments of our own intelligence community. And they don't get it right 100% of the time. I get that. But what I have seen makes it clear that at the same time that you were skeptical of our intelligence community's assessments, you would not apply the same skepticism to information that came from sympathizers of Russia and Assad. And I think that's something that we should all be concerned about. When Russia was denying Assad's use of chemical weapons, they accused the U.S. of supporting terrorists. This is a line that Putin used frequently during the Syrian civil war as he supported Assad. Syrian officials made similar comments. They did it repeatedly. They did it in public. They did it at the United Nations. In 2016, you gave an interview in which you said, and this is a quote, "The U.S. is providing direct and indirect support to terrorist groups in order to overthrow the Syrian government." And in 2019, on the Democratic presidential debate stage, you said of President Trump, this is a quote, "This current president is continuing to betray us. We were supposed to be going after al-Qaeda, but over years now, not only have we not gone after al-Qaeda, our president is supporting al-Qaeda." So I'm interested to hear, what was your goal in saying these things? And did you consider, before saying them, the motives of Iran and Russia, what their motives might have been before making these claims?
Senator, as someone who enlisted in the military specifically because of al-Qaeda's terrorist attack on 9/11 and committing myself and my life to doing what I could to defeat these terrorists, it was shocking and a betrayal to me and every person who was killed on 9/11, their families and my brothers and sisters in uniform. When, as a member of Congress, I learned about President Obama's dual programs that he had begun really to overthrow the regime of Syria, and being willing to, through the CIA's Timber Sycamore program that has now been made public, of working with and arming and equipping al-Qaeda in an effort to overthrow that regime, starting yet another regime change war in the Middle East. DoD Train and Equip program, again, begun under President Obama, is widely been known, looked at, and studied, that ultimately resulted in over $500 million being used to train who they called moderate rebels, but were actually fighters working with and aligned with al-Qaeda's affiliate on the ground in Syria, all to move forward with their regime change and not acknowledging what was obvious at the time and what has unfortunately borne true, which was that a regime change war in Syria, much like the regime change wars in Iraq, the toppling of Gaddafi and Mubarak, while these are all dictators, would likely result in the rise of Islamist extremists like al-Qaeda taking power. I shed no tears for the fall of the Assad regime, but today we have an Islamist extremist who is now in charge of Syria, as I said, who danced on the streets to celebrate the 9/11 attack, who ruled over Idlib with an Islamist extremist governance, and who has already begun to persecute and kill and arrest religious minorities like Christians in Syria.
I understand.
Why that should be acceptable to anyone is beyond me.
It shouldn't
is
be.
certainly
and
not
I
in our
understand,
interests.
and I appreciate your answer, and thank you. My concern has to do with the tendency to repeat Russian and Syrian, and even in some cases, I think we'll get into in the closed session, Iranian information, and to discount what comes from our intelligence community.
Senator, every American deserves to know that people in our own government were providing support to our sworn enemy, al-Qaeda. That should not be acceptable by anyone.
Thank you, Senator Kelly and Ms. Gabbard. In conclusion, Senator Warner.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, one of the things I love about this committee, and I know folks who are here for Ms. Gabbard may not fully realize, but this has always been a bipartisan committee. And you know, my friend Richard Burr, who said we always kind of followed the truth. One of the things I was always proudest of in the very challenging Russia investigation was, you know, people would come in, they didn't know whether the staffer was a Democrat or Republican, because we were all looking out for the same thing. Ms. Gabbard, I support and commend you for your service. But we have heard this morning taking some individuals' advice on chemical attacks, not taking American intelligence community that, as we subsequently discovered, had iffy ties, not enough due diligence. We've heard this morning on your trip to Lebanon that you weren't fully aware that the folks who originally paid for the trip had these relations and ties to this Syrian party. I know I've asked, and you and I understand on the trip that you said you met with Shia religious figures and you didn't know who were there, who they were. I can understand that, although I can't imagine Shia religious figures that in the Bekaa Valley that didn't have ties to Hezbollah. And we can have a difference of opinion on TikTok. The chairman and I feel very strongly that it is a national security threat. On 702, I'm candidly confused. I thought you answered Senator Wyden you're in favor of a warrant. Senator Cornyn, I thought you backed off of that. And then on Edward Snowden, you won't back off of Brave. You won't back off of your legislation. You won't call him a traitor. And I think, again, about this is being watched by our allies around the world. I think even RT's been tweeting about it today, blasting me. And the men and women of the intelligence community. I don't know how they're going to have confidence that if under your leadership, if somebody else stepped out, that you wouldn't take the same position that you've not walked away from on Mr. Snowden. So I guess my last question, and this is one I think was in some of the press, and I believe you and your husband took a trip to Rome last summer. And you know, I'm not talking about the conference. I think you didn't ask who paid for the trip. I just want to get this off the record right now. Not if you and your husband reimbursed, but did you pay for the trip in the outset, or
There was a
made the booking?
nonprofit organization that was coordinating with the Vatican to set up this meeting that was centered around peace and security interests in the Western Hemisphere.
I'm not going to go into
that
I
paid
just want
for the
to
trip.
just make sure. So you didn't understand your trip was paid for by a gentleman named Pierre Louvarier and the Clementi Foundation?
The nonprofit,
Okay,
my
I just say,
understanding,
there
was
is
paid
extensive records
paid
of-
for the trip.
Mr. Louvarier has enormous ties to Konstantin Malovov. I'm mispronouncing his name, but who is somebody that America has sanctioned. I imagine we can get into this in the classified hearing, but again, the due diligence that's required before you take these trips or make these assumptions is something that I find very troubling.